So that's such a good question about why is it that I preach in series, and my answer really starts with the fact that originally I didn't. I come from the Methodist tradition, and in the Methodist tradition there is the lectionary, which if you've ever been part of a Catholic or an Episcopal church, they have those assigned readings every week, and in my seminary we were taught that's the way to do it, and so my first 6 months or so at my very first appointment back in 1990, I was preaching that lectionary, and gradually I came to see that the people in that church, they had no idea where I was getting the passages I was preaching from on a Sunday. They didn't know the lectionary existed. They didn't know it was important. And the thought of trying to educate them in this is why you should preach out of the lectionary was just daunting. And so I began to think, well, why don't I preach in a way that I first collect all the dots so that they can help connect the dots? Why don't I begin to preach in series? And the very first series that I ever preached, starting in January of 1991, I remember the title of that series because it was so creative. It was, you ready? You ready? Proverbs. How's that for a great series title? We're going to preach on Proverbs. Well, from that sort of obvious, mastering the obvious beginning, I was able to grow and learn and change, and reading people like Chuck Swindoll or listening to people like Andy Stanley in those early years, I was able to realize, or Stuart Briscoe, there's a better way to name and put series together than Messages on Proverbs. So the reason that I believe in preaching in series is because of what happened when I didn't. And now that I do, I know that by preaching in series, you're able to do for church life what Who Shot JR did for television life. Some of you may remember that old TV show Dallas, and there was a cliffhanger one year, Who Shot JR? And all summer long, waiting for the next season to start, that was the phenomenon in the culture. Who was it? Who shot J.R. Ewing? And that's what I want to have happen in sermon series, that people are longing to find out what's going to happen in the next week's episode. I don't want to miss out on what that series is all about. So that's why I preach in series, because I know what happens when you don't. And I've seen what happened when you do. People's mind connects with what has just happened, and they anticipate what's going to happen. How does preaching in series benefit the congregation I get to serve? And there's really two ways. The first way is when I do series that are based primarily on a particular book of the Bible. For example, a few years ago I had a series called Crash Test Dummies. And that was a way to preach about the book of Judges, because the people in the book of Judges keep doing the same ridiculous thing over and over and over again. And then a couple of years later I had a series called Behind the Scenes, and that was a series on the book of Esther, because in the book of Esther God operates behind the scenes. God's name is purposely not mentioned. And one other example, I had a series called Solutionists, and that was on the book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, the man, and Nehemiah, his book, which is part memoir and part history and all excitement. Nehemiah is not about finding problems, because anybody can do that. Nehemiah was a guy who located solutions, and so I just decided we're going to be a church full of people who are solutionists. So in each of those occasions, it was a way to familiarize the people of Good Shepherd with a book of the Bible that otherwise they probably would never even open. I mean, think about it. Judges and Nehemiah and Esther, those are books people avoid. And yet, because they were put in the sermon series, and because the sermon series were captured in kind of a provocative title, they were glued in. Early in 2021, for example, I had a message series called Mindful, all about how you think, because I don't know if you noticed this or not, but the people of our land are being assaulted mentally with social media. And so the tool that we used throughout that series was we invited people, instead of beginning their days in the world, to begin their days in the Word. And so we provide daily reading prompts that would take them through books of the Bible. And so not only would I preach about what happens in your mind really matters on Sunday, but then Monday through Friday, we gave them this early morning tool. Here's how you can orient your mind first thing of the day so that your mind will be oriented towards the things of God the rest of the day. And those reading prompts, word before world, as we call them, they've really turned into a little bit of a phenomenon and so much characterize the lives of the people of Good Shepherd. So that's just one of the benefits of preaching in series. You can resource the people of the church for their living the messages out Monday through Friday. So how is it that you make series interesting? I really have two kind of rules for making series interesting. One, as I alluded to earlier in this video, is that ability to take a single book of the Bible and put sort of a topical title over it. Solutionists for Nehemiah, behind the scenes for Esther, famous last words for 2 Timothy, which were, after all, the last words that Paul ever wrote. So a book of the Bible with a title over it that sounds worlds more interesting than saying, we're going to have a sermon series on 2 Timothy now. No, that doesn't really cut it, because believe it or not, our competition is the wordsmiths and the creative geniuses at Disney and Nike and ESPN. So that's one way I sort of keep it interesting. The other way is I'm always on the lookout for cultural phrases or common idioms, and how can they either be altered just a little bit or taken as is, and again, placed over a concept that I want to preach. Late in 2020, the lockdown year, when everybody was having a lot of time, whether they liked it or not, with their families, I had a series called It Runs in the Family. And that's a common phrase. It didn't need any adjusting, but I was able to, and this was one of those topical series where always full of biblical messages. But I hopscotched around the Bible some to locate the things that I wanted to preach on, all about those things that run in the family. It was a series on parenting and a series on marriage and a series on encouragement. And another message series that worked out a little bit that way was taking the common phrase, well, that's the calm before the storm, and think about how sick that is. That you regard calm as the exception and storms as inevitable. And so I decided to turn it around. No, let's take a look at the storm before the calm. Voila! There's a message series that people hear, their eyebrows raised. You twisted that saying a little bit, the storm before the calm, and got the people to realize that storms are not inevitable. Storms instead can be preparatory. That the storms are God's preparation for the calm that He so longs for us to live in the middle of.